Lonesome Hollow. The very name sounded like a sigh caught in the wind. A small town drowned in red dust, where everything seemed worn down and hardened with time. The main street ran straight through its middle, no wider than 2 wagons passing slow. On either side stood squat wooden buildings, their signs sun-bleached and cracked, windows patched with planks where the glass had long since given way. When the prairie wind rolled through, the dust rose in choking swirls, sneaking in through half-shut doors. The heart of the town was not the church, nor the post office, but the hollow saloon. Its lamps burned yellow every night, spilling light into the street while whiskey fumes tangled with cigar smoke inside. The place pulsed with the restless clamor of drifters and cowhands. Men who came to drown fatigue, dodge loneliness, or simply watch a woman's smile flicker beneath the broken chords of an old piano. That night, the hollow saloon overflowed. A wager had just won himself a handful of silver at the dice table, shouting until his throat rasped raw. Wooden chairs groaned under the weight of men leaning heavy with drink. It could have been any other night, save for a new presence. Gideon Callahan. He came without fanfare, without a word. A dark brown duster hung from his broad shoulders, his boots caked in trail dust. Tall, solid, he stood out. Though no one knew his name, he did not slam his fist for whiskey or join the laughter. Instead, he claimed a shadowed corner table, settling quiet, eyes sweeping the room with a watchfulness that measured as much as it withheld. Men noticed him in their own way, not because of fine dress, but because of the weight of his silence, the kind of silence that belonged to a man who needed no proving. And at his hip rested a silver revolver, polished, crafted, not the kind bought cheap along the trail. When Gideon lifted his glass for the first sip, the piano struck up a tune. The crowd stirred, chairs scraped, whistles pierced the air. From behind the curtain, Lenora Blake stepped out. Her dress was deep red, frayed at the edges, the skirt flaring with her stride. A scrap of cloth swung from her hand as she danced. She was the only black woman in the saloon, likely the only one in the town. She smiled as she moved, her arm outstretched, eyes glimmering beneath the dim oil lamps. The men roared, coins clattered to the floor, and bolder tongues spat crude praise. But Gideon saw what most did not. That smile never reached her eyes. Her eyes held a weariness, fathoms deep, the kind worn by someone who had learned to mask herself in gesture, but could not quite hide the fractures within. For a fleeting moment, their gazes met. Lenora's eyes swept the room, searching for a safe place to rest, and then locked on the man in the corner. His gaze was different, neither greedy, nor mocking, not even dismissive. It was steady, distant in one sense, yet strangely recognizing. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. The moment passed. Lenora spun back into her dance, the crowd swallowing her whole. Still, something stirred inside her, like the brush of a hand across an old wound. Not to deepen the hurt, but to remind her it still lived beneath the skin. Gideon stayed unmoved, sipping slow, his eyes never straying. He didn't cheer, didn't toss coins, didn't join the frenzy. He only watched as though memorizing each motion, not because of allure, but because he recognized the weight she carried behind them. The night wore on loud as ever. Yet something lingered. For Lenora, it was that quiet gaze left in her mind like a question without an answer. For Gideon, it was the memory of her smile that never touched her eyes, a familiar marker of souls who had borne more than they should. Outside, the prairie wind still drove red dust through the street of Lonesome Hollow. But in that corner of a smoke-filled saloon, 2 pairs of eyes had touched, leaving behind a trace of something unspoken, a spark at the edge of a story neither of them yet knew they were about to live. Lenora Blake was no stranger in the hollow saloon. Any man who had passed through Lonesome Hollow knew of her, not as an easy woman, but as an apparition that left them aching and restless in equal measure. Every night she appeared beneath the weak yellow glow of oil lamps strung from the rafters, her dark red dress brushing the wooden floor, her shoes striking time to the faltering piano. Lenora smiled, stretching out her hand, gliding past the half-formed touches that reached for her. And when a rough hand lunged too close, she slipped away like a dancer, avoiding the edge of a blade. The men spun their stories about her. Some swore she would sit on any lap for the right price. Others insisted she had never once followed a man upstairs. No one knew the truth because Lenora lived along the narrowest of lines. She danced. She sometimes drank with patrons, but her glass was more water than whiskey. She never sold herself, yet she never declared it either. For in this world, denial was worth less than a silent step away. That night, as always, she slipped from the back door into the room's blaze of smoke and noise, her long curls tied in haste, a few strands clinging to her damp cheek. The smile was painted on, but her eyes had been trained to skim the crowd without settling. Whistles chased her name. Hands waved her closer. She spun, her skirt flaring wide, her shoes beating a drum beat of survival. In the shadows, Gideon Callahan still sat. He was nothing like the others choking the room with laughter and liquor. He didn't drink hard, didn't shout, didn't fling coins to prove himself. He leaned back in silence, eyes following Lenora as if she were a book no one else bothered to read. She felt it, his gaze. At first, it set her teeth on edge. Another man staring, another man measuring, but slowly she noticed what was missing. No predator's hunger, no sneer of contempt, only stillness. And in that stillness, something unsettled her, though a part of her felt strangely lighter for it. As the night deepened, trouble arrived the way it always did. A young cowboy, drunk and flushed, grabbed her wrist as she passed. "Sit down, sweetheart," he slurred, breath heavy with whiskey. "I'll pay your price tonight." Lenora yanked back, her smile stiffening. She knew this routine. Slip away, distract, let the man collapse under his own liquor. But this one gripped tighter, dragging her toward his table. Her red scarf slipped from her hand. Her dark eyes flashed with anger, though she bit it back. Before she could twist free, a figure rose from the shadows. Gideon Callahan. He said nothing. He simply placed his broad hand on the cowboy's shoulder. The grip was not violent, but it carried weight like the desert's own silence pressing down. The drunk looked up, and Gideon's eyes met his. Calm, cold, like steel drawn without a sound. No fight broke out. No blows were thrown. Just that gaze, that steady hand, and the cowboy let go. Hickey slumped back into his chair, muttering, drowning himself in another drink. Lenora stood motionless, her breath caught. For years, she had fought her battles alone, never needing, never trusting anyone to step in. And yet, here was a man who didn't exploit the moment, didn't claim a reward. He simply stood because it was the right thing. "You all right?" Gideon asked, his voice low and graveled, carrying the long miles of wind and dust. She blinked, nodding quickly. I'm fine." Her smile faltered, unsteady now, stripped of its practiced ease. He gave a short nod, turned, and returned to his corner, silent as before. The exchange was so brief that most in the saloon never marked it, just another ripple in the noise. But for Lenora, it cut deep and lingered. No one in Lonesome Hollow had ever stood for her. Not like that. The piano picked up again. Laughter roared on, and the night pressed forward. Yet Lenora's rhythm was altered. As she turned and spun, her eyes strayed unbidden to the shadowed corner where Gideon sat. He did not look at her as possession. He looked at her as if he recognized something of himself in her wearied gaze, and for the first time in years, her step faltered. Night settled over Lonesome Hollow at its own slow pace. But inside the saloon, laughter clung stubbornly to the last drops of liquor. When the piano stuttered into silence, Gideon Callahan shifted back his chair, laid a few silver coins on the table, and rose. His steps were unhurried, steady, the weight of them carrying him across the warped floorboards to the door. Hinges groaned as the wood swung wide, letting in the cool prairie wind. For most men in the room, his leaving meant nothing. But from above, Lenora Blake noticed. She stood in the narrow room set aside for dancers to catch their breath. A threadbare curtain pulled aside just enough for her to look out. The street below was veiled in dust, and in the lantern light, Gideon's figure cut sharp against the night. The long brown coat powdered with trail grit, his frame upright, quiet, as though he bridged the raucous town and the silence of the open land. Lenora couldn't name the reason she lingered there, only that something held her gaze fast. He had gone a stretch down the street before he turned, not to check his back, not to glance at the saloon, but as if searching for something unseen. His eyes lifted, met hers through the thin slit of fabric. She froze, pulse quickening. Gideon did not smile. He only gave a brief nod, firm, almost solemn, as if to acknowledge her existence in the dark. Startled, she dropped the curtain, heat rushing to her cheeks, scolding herself for the slip. Yet the gesture clung to her mind like ink spilled deep into paper, impossible to wash away. The nights that followed, Gideon returned, not often enough to draw attention, but with a rhythm Lenora could not help but notice. He always chose the same shadowed corner, ordered a bottle of good whiskey, and drank slow. He never beckoned her, never raised his voice like the others. He simply sat, sometimes letting his gaze find her as she turned beneath the lamps. And when the night ended, he left coins on the table, more than anyone else paid, without once pressing them into her hand. There were no sudden grasps, no knowing smirks, only that quiet leaving, as if repaying a debt to a sorrowful tune. At first she bristled. A silent man watching could feel more dangerous than the loudest drunk. But little by little she saw there was nothing predatory in it. His eyes did not devour. They read. Every step, every tired smile of hers he seemed to hold like words on a page. And strangely being seen in that way did not wear her down. It reminded her she was more than a dancer spinning circles in smoke. One evening, after a set ended, she made her rounds collecting money from the floor and tabletops. Passing Gideon's table, her fingers brushed the rim of his glass as she gathered his bills. He only tilted his head, gray eyes meeting hers for a heartbeat. Not a word was spoken, but it was enough to steal her breath, enough to send her hurrying on, skirts sweeping, heart unsettled. His silence was not contempt and not indifference. It was a silence that left room for her to breathe. Other nights, when the saloon emptied and she stepped out back for air, she found traces of him, a still warm stub of tobacco, a fresh set of boot prints, or sometimes the man himself leaning against a post in the lantern's edge. He never pressed words on her. He'd simply tip his head in greeting, then return his eyes to the horizon, smoke drifting into the black. Oddly enough, that ease was what made her feel safest. Once, after a long set had spun her near to collapse, she stumbled coming off the stage. Gideon was there, hand closing gently around her elbow. The touch was firm but careful, as though he feared she might fall. She murmured, thanks, eyes lowered, and he let go at once, retreating to his chair as if nothing had passed. For her, though, the moment etched itself deep. It was unlike any touch she'd known, not a grasp to claim, not a snare to bind, but a hand simply holding her steady. Later that same night, she stood once more by the upstairs window. Below. Gideon walked the main road, his stride unhurried. He stopped, lifted his gaze, and again gave that single nod. This time, Lenora did not drop the curtain. A small smile stirred on her lips. No stage trick, no painted mask, but a real smile, fragile and surprising even to her. And in the dark of Lonesome Hollow, with the noise of the saloon fading behind them, two distant figures found a thread tying them together. Thin, unseen, yet stronger than all the clamor outside. That night, the saloon air grew so thick that Lenora thought she might choke. Smoke hung in layers, laughter tangled with curses, and the piano stumbled through its tune. She spun one last circle, forcing a smile for the men pounding their fists on the tables, then slipped behind the curtain. Her skin burned under the lamps, breath sharp, and all she wanted was a gulp of clean air. She stepped into the narrow hall and froze. Gideon Callahan stood there, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding an unlit cigarette. He didn't rush, didn't fidget. His broad frame swallowed the glow of the wall lamp. For a moment, she stared, not from fear, but because of the calm rolling off him, a calm that clashed so hard with the chaos behind her. Stifling in there, Gideon said, his voice low and rough, carrying just enough to be heard. No command, no lewd suggestion. He flicked a glance at her, then nodded toward the back door. Walk a while. Her chest tightened. This was the first time a man had asked her out alone. For years, she had rehearsed refusals, honed the instinct to draw lines sharp enough to keep herself safe. But the refusal never came. His eyes held no pressure, only a quiet opening. And against her own habit, she nodded. They stepped outside together. The main street of Lonesome Hollow lay hushed, only a few dim lamps burning before shops long shut. The moon hung pale above, laying its silver wash across the dust, making even the red earth glimmer faint. Wind carried scents of dry grass and chimney smoke from cabins out on the edge of town. A gust tugged at her dress, baring her thin legs to the cold. She tugged the fabric down, embarrassed. Gideon noticed. Without a word, he slid his coat from his shoulders and laid it across hers. Heavy wool smelling faint of leather, smoke, and prairie wind draped around her like a shield. Chill in the air, he said simply, his voice scratchy. No insinuation, no glint of possession. Just care. She stilled, fingers clutching the lapels tight. Such an ordinary gesture, so free of flourish. Yet it struck her harder than any polished compliment. For the first time in years, someone had treated her not as spectacle, not as pastime, but as a person worth guarding. Heat rose in her chest that had nothing to do with the coat. At first, they walked in silence. His boots struck steady against the dirt while she kept her skirts from the dust. She had never known a man's company without the need to brace herself. Yet this quiet felt different. Not heavy, but steady, a silence that seemed to hold her upright. "How long you been in this town?" Gideon asked at last. "Few years," she answered, eyes fixed on the fields glowing under the moon. He left it there. No probing, no curiosity turned sharp. She waited for the questions she'd learned to expect about her past, about what she'd sold, about what she'd given away. But nothing came. Only the wind sighing through a fence post. Only their steps keeping time. And in that gap, words rose in her unbidden. "I came up from the south," she said softly. "Traveling with a group. Stopped here. Sometimes I think I should have kept moving." Gideon gave a short nod as though he understood. No judgment, no pity, just acceptance. "Doesn't matter much where you end up," she went on, voice rasping. "People only see what they want. A woman dancing on a stage. That's all she'll ever be to them." Her throat closed. She had never said it aloud before. And somehow speaking it to Gideon didn't feel like loss. It felt like relief. They stopped beneath the frame of an abandoned storefront. Gideon leaned against the post, gaze stretched far down the road. "As for me," he said quietly, "I've gone so many places I've lost count. But tonight, maybe I'm seeing something different." She turned to look at him. His face bore the marks of wind and dust, rugged, but not cruel. In the moonlight, his gray eyes carried a clarity that startled her. For once, she felt no deception, no mask, just a plain truth in his regard. They walked back toward the saloon, silence wrapping around them like a blanket against the night's chill. Lenora felt her shoulders ease, her chest lighter. She didn't need the painted smile. She didn't need to brace for the next intrusion. When the saloon lamps glowed again at the street's end, she slowed. "I should head back," she murmured. Gideon inclined his head. "Thank you for walking with me." The words rooted her in place. No man had ever thanked her. Not for a dance, not for a smile, and certainly not for simply sharing a stretch of road. His thanks, simple as it was, felt heavier than gold. She stepped back inside with a tread far lighter than before. The guard around her heart still stood, but something small had been planted beneath it. That night, for the first time, she had felt safe beside a man. And to Lenora, that was worth more than all the coins ever tossed onto a saloon floor. In the days that followed, Gideon Callahan's presence became a rhythm in Lenora's life. As steady as the crooked piano chords and the smoke pressed deep into the saloon's timber walls, he still kept to the corner where the yellow lamplight barely reached, sipping whiskey slow. Few men noticed him at all. But Lenora did. Amid the coarse laughter and the bite of cheap liquor, his figure rose like a rare silence she couldn't help but seek. It soon turned into habit. After her last dance each night, her feet carried her to the back door without thought. Gideon was always there, leaning against the weathered post, waiting as if that were the natural order of things. He didn't beckon, didn't ask. By his sheer presence, he gave her space to breathe, to feel less hollow after the exhausting spin of the night. Slowly, Lenora felt something stir within her chest. A quiet anticipation, knowing he was outside waiting, lightened her steps on the stage, softened the bitterness in her practiced smile. Together, they walked down the dusted street, then along the dirt road that curved toward the small river beyond town. The moon cast its thin silver across the rippling water, turning it into a sheet of shifting light. They sat side by side on a fallen log, the night air rich with the scent of dry grass and distant chimney smoke. "Why do you sit alone like that in the saloon?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Because I'd rather watch than shout," Gideon replied, eyes fixed on the water. "There are things you only notice when you stay still." She fell quiet, struck by how close his answer lay to her own way of surviving. Silence could be a kind of shield. Hugging her knees, she gazed at her reflection, trembling in the river. "I used to think I'd have a small house, a garden, maybe a porch to sit on with a book come evening. Not much of a dream, but it feels too rich for me now." The moonlight caught the creases at the edges of his eyes as he tilted his head. "Dreams aren't rich or poor," he said. "Only whether you hold to them." A smile touched her lips, edged with sorrow. "Easy to say, but what is a dancer like me besides a handful of steps and hollow laughter?" He gave no quick answer. His broad, work-worn hand rested on the log between them, close to hers. Then, as if without thinking, his finger brushed against her slender knuckles. The touch carried no demand, no claim, just a simple presence. Her heart leapt, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she lifted her eyes to meet his. What she found there was steady, sincere, stripped of hunger or haste. For the first time in years, she felt seen as something more than an object to be handled. "You're not like any man I've known," she whispered. In a tremor she could not name, Lenora leaned close and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was short, awkward, yet honest. A secret laid bare in the dark. Gideon didn't rush to deepen it. He only clasped her hand, his palm warm, covering the faint tremor. When she drew back, face hot with confusion, he gave her a soft smile, his eyes calm with quiet restraint. They lingered there, wordless, letting the wind and the murmur of water fill the space. In that hush, Lenora heard her own heart beat clearer than she ever had on any stage. When they finally rose to leave, she still wore his coat, the one he had laid across her shoulders nights before. The heavy fabric swallowed her frame, making her feel small yet shielded. Every step beside Gideon carried both peace and unease. A wall began to take shape inside her. He was Gideon Callahan, a man of means, a figure who could choose any companion he wished. And she, a dancer in a red dress, living off the coins scattered on splintered wood. The divide stretched wide, reminding her with each step that they came from worlds too far apart. At the back of the saloon, she halted. "Thank you for listening," she said, her voice threaded with something she couldn't quite name. He inclined his head. "Whenever you need air again, I'll be there." She turned toward the door, but before stepping inside, she looked back. He stood under the moon's pale glow, tall and unmoving. He said nothing more, only tipped the brim of his hat in a wordless farewell. Her heart clenched at the sight. That night, in her cramped lodging, Lenora curled beneath the coat, unable to sleep. For the first time in years, fear curled in her chest. Not fear of drunken hands or looming debts, but fear of how fiercely she longed for something beautiful that might vanish with the dawn. In her mind, two voices wrestled. One hissed that he was too far above her and she too far below. But another gentler voice answered, even if only for a breath of time, she had lived as a woman seen, cherished without price, and she knew that alone had already changed everything. That evening the air inside the hollow saloon was thicker than usual. A drunk had pulled Lenora into a corner, spilling crude words loud enough to earn laughter from the whole room. She broke free, but each word cut like a blade. She finished her last dance with a painted smile. Yet when the lamps dimmed, her eyes were hollow. On the porch, Gideon Callahan was waiting. He didn't ask questions, didn't wear pity on his face. He simply laid his heavy, steady hand against her back. And said quietly, "Come on." This time, he didn't stop at the main street. A horse stood waiting, its mane tossing silver under the moon. Gideon lifted her onto the saddle, then swung up behind, his arm circling firm around her waist. Her breath stirred against his coat, while the beat of his heart pressed solid into her back. The horse carried them out of town, leaving behind the yellow light and the cheap laughter. They rode deep into the prairie until a small cabin emerged at the edge of scattered woods. Rain began to fall light at first, then steady against the old roof. Gideon helped her down, guiding her inside. The room was plain, cold hearth, rough chairs, the smell of damp timber. But to Lenora, it felt like the first place free of boots stomping and whistles chasing. He built a fire, coaxing sparks into flame until warmth filled the room, painting her face in gold. She sat, hands clasped, gaze distant. Gideon settled across from her, the firelight catching in his gray eyes. For a long while, neither spoke. Only rain pattered on the roof. Only logs cracked in the grate. At last, she whispered, "All my life, no one's ever stood up for me until you." Her voice trembled as though frightened of the truth she had spoken. Gideon didn't answer with words. He only reached across and set his hand over hers. The weight was gentle, enough to remind her she was no longer alone. She raised her head. Her dark eyes, damp and searching, met his gaze. And in that meeting, she let fall the mask she'd worn for years. He leaned closer, rough hand lifting her chin as if it were porcelain. His thumb brushed the corner of her mouth before he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was slow, cautious at first, like a question offered, then deeper, more certain. She trembled, but did not pull away. She leaned into him instead, giving over a trust she had never risked before. The embrace came as natural as breath. His coat slid from her shoulders, pooling on the floor. His arms closed her in, broad hands tracing the length of her back, pausing, hesitant. She caught his wrist, breath unsteady, eyes meeting his with fear and daring both. "You don't know," she whispered, voice breaking. "This is my first time." He froze. Firelight shone in his eyes, reflecting astonishment, and a sorrow so sharp it was almost reverence. A dancer in a town like this, carrying such a truth, it struck him silent. But he believed her because the honesty in her gaze was too stark to be doubted. His touch softened, his palm smoothing the line of her spine. Not just a caress, but a promise unspoken that she would never be left to the dark again. Tears slipped down her cheeks, even as her lips sought his, hungry, certain. Outside, rain fell in torrent. Inside, the fire blazed bright, wrapping them both in heat. Flesh met flesh, heart against heart, breaths mingling, the divisions of class and shame. The weight of years slipped away. There remained only a weathered man and a woman daring to open herself at last, giving everything. That night, Lenora was not the dancer of the hollow saloon. She was herself, fragile, yearning, cherished, and Gideon, with strength bound in gentleness, received her as something sacred. By morning, the rain had passed. Sunlight poured through the small window, laying bright bands across the floorboards. Lenora woke in his arms, smiling faintly at the peace etched on his sleeping face. Beyond the walls, the prairie gleamed fresh-washed. The world itself seeming to begin anew. Rumors in the hollow saloon never stopped flowing. Every strange horse tied outside brought with it a fresh tale, and that night the tale walked in on 2 polished boots out of Kansas City. He was nothing like the broke drifters who usually crowded the room. His coat was cut from imported velvet. His shoes gleamed, and every time he laughed, the oversized gold ring on his hand caught the lamplight like a signal fire. He entered as though the saloon belonged to him, claimed the largest table, ordered the finest whiskey, and tossed down a stack of bills as if scattering scraps to a pack of dogs. The room stirred to life around him. Lenora stepped out as she always did. Her skirt swept through the smoky light, her smile practiced and flawless. But the stranger's gaze fixed on her at once. It was a look she knew too well. Not admiration, not respect, but the measuring stare of a man choosing merchandise he believed he had already bought. When the dance ended and she circled to collect coins, he shoved back his chair and boomed across the room. "You there? Tonight, I want you. Name your price." The saloon froze. Lenora's hand tightened around her red handkerchief. Whiskey thickened the air as every eye turned toward her. She drew a long breath, her lips still curved in polite form, though her eyes went cold. "I'm sorry, sir. That is not what I do." His laugh cut sharp. He strode forward and slapped his palm on the table, rattling glasses, sending liquor flying. "Not what you do. Who do you think you are? A cheap dancer in this dust-choked hole, daring to turn down my money." The crowd murmured. Some laughed, others whistled. A few buried themselves in their glasses, unwilling to be caught in it. Lenora stood firm, her smile gone. Her dark eyes lit with quiet defiance. "You may buy drink. You may buy music," she said, voice trembling, but clear. "You cannot buy me." The words landed like a slap. His face flushed crimson before he barked a jagged laugh. "Do you truly believe you're above it? A saloon girl who won't sit at a table, who won't serve a man, is no better than a broken chair in this place. Useless." Laughter swelled again. Lenora bowed her head, her heart hammering. No tears came. She had spent years training them not to. She had learned to swallow insult, to hold her silence to survive. Yet each word scraped her raw. The barkeep shot her a quick glance, uneasy. The owner lingered in the corner, making no move to intervene. To them, money was the loudest voice, and the stranger carried more than any other. Lenora turned and walked toward the curtain, her back straight, though the jeers trailed her like barbed wire. "Won't even take money," a man snorted. "Something's wrong with her." Another chuckled. "Think she's better than us?" Her chest ached, each word pressing down like stone. Still, she walked, unbending, unwilling to let them see her break. Inside her, patience burned like fire, contained yet searing. Out on the porch, night air, thick with dust, closed around her. She leaned against the post, dragging in a breath to steady herself. Her hands shook, but her eyes hardened, catching a glint of resolve. She knew then she had stepped into a new snare, where wealth and power would weigh heavy on her fragile freedom, and where each choice might cost her the little piece of herself she had managed to keep. The back room of the hollow saloon was always heavier than the front. No music, no laughter, only smoke soaked into old pine boards and a single oil lamp throwing shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. That night, as Lenora stepped off the stage, Harlan Crook, the saloon's keeper, beckoned her over. His voice was ragged with drink, yet sharp as a blade sheathed in grease. "Sit down, Lenora," he rasped, pointing at the chair across from him. She hesitated, then obeyed. Her body ached. Her legs trembled from the night's endless turns. But it wasn't fatigue that tightened her chest. It was the look in his eyes. Harlan dragged a crumpled paper from a drawer and slapped it flat on the table. The ink had faded, but the figure scrawled across it still burned clear. $2,000. Her throat closed. "What? What is this debt?" he said. "Simple as iron. You signed it 3 years back when I gave you a place here. Clothes, music, meals, everything it took to turn you into Lenora Blake. The woman men paid to see." She remembered when she'd first stumbled into Lonesome Hollow with no roof, no coin. He had given her work. She hadn't read the fine print, hadn't dared. Without that signature, she would have slept in the street. For 3 years, she had danced, gathered tips, handed over coin after coin. She thought she had paid her due, yet the number lay there like a trap she had never escaped. "I've worked. I've given you so much already." Her voice broke. "And you still owe." Harlan cut in, his eyes narrowing. "Owe means pay. That simple." Her hands clenched, nails biting her palms. "I can't pay that sum." He leaned back, a crooked smile creeping over his lips. "Then you're lucky. There's a man willing to pay for you. The Kansas City gent you saw tonight. He's got money to burn. Be agreeable and this debt vanishes." The blood drained from her face. Sweat clung to her temples as she shook her head. "No, I can't." His fist cracked against the table, the lamp trembling. "Who do you think you are to refuse? You're a saloon girl living off this place, clothed by this place, breathing because of this place. Don't play proud with me. You don't please the patrons. You don't work here. And that paper, one word from me to the law and you'll rot in a cell for default." The words hammered her chest. Prison bars flashed in her mind. The town's sneer pressing in from every side. She felt herself teetering on the edge of a pit with no bottom. "You've got until week's end," Harlan said, each word hammered down like nails. "Pay up or obey. There's no third choice." Her lips pressed tight, but tears welled in her eyes. Years she had borne insults, the jeers of men, and swallowed everyone. But never a despair pressed so heavy. The debt lay before her like a chain dragging her back to the mud she had fought to crawl out of. She wanted to scream, to rip the paper, to smash the table, but her body stayed frozen. She rose at last, unsteady, no fight left in her throat. Harlan watched her with the satisfied look of a man holding the rope. He folded the paper, slid it into his coat, a reminder that her fate lay in his pocket. The door closed behind her. She leaned against the wall, her heart searing. Laughter drifted from the saloon. The piano hammered away, but to her it sounded miles distant. Her steps turned heavy, each board beneath her feet dragging her down. A mirror hung in the hallway. She caught sight of herself. Smudged paint, weary eyes, shoulders trembling beneath a gaudy dress. For the first time, she saw the truth clear. She was no free woman. She was a commodity, a caged bird trotted out to sing, while others clapped. Tears fell, though her sobs stayed buried. She had always swallowed them, but this time the weight was so thick her chest felt starved of air. Somewhere beyond the dust and dark, Gideon still existed. His image flickered faint in her mind, a lantern light on the horizon. Yet even that glow seemed too dim to cut through the chain coiled tight around her throat. Harlan held the power, and the town needed no more than one paper to grind her life into dust. She stumbled out to the back steps, sinking down onto the cold boards, arms wrapped around herself. A fine mist rode the wind, dampening her hair, her dress, her skin. In the hush of the night, the only sound was her heart, pounding hard, urging her toward a way out. But every road before her seemed locked behind doors that would never open. Lenora closed her eyes and whispered the prayer she had never dared before. "Please don't leave me alone." Rumors in the saloon spread faster than prairie wind. By the next evening, all of Lonesome Hollow had heard the tale. Lenora Blake, cornered with a paper demanding $2,000. And the wealthy stranger from Kansas City waiting for her to fall into his hands. Men whispered into their glasses. Women snickered behind kerchiefs. Few pied her. Most savored the spectacle. She stepped onto the floor in worn shoes, her smile trembling worse than ever beneath the yellow lamps. The powder on her face could not hide the red swell around her eyes. Yet in the corner, still and steady as stone, sat Gideon Callahan. His silence held sharpness, his gray eyes cutting through the jeers like a drawn blade. When the tune ended, Harlan Crook, the saloon keeper, crooked his finger and called Lenora to the back room. She knew what awaited, but when she entered, Gideon was already there. Harlan frowned, cigar clenched between his teeth. "Mr. Callahan, this isn't your business. We're discussing private matters." Gideon said nothing. He set a heavy leather sack on the table. The clink of coin struck the room like a gunshot. Harlan blinked, then narrowed his eyes. Gideon pulled the cord loose. Silver dollars spilled bright across the wood. 2,000, Gideon said, his voice low as thunder. "Her debt paid in full." The room stilled. Harlan's mouth hung open, smoke curling from his lips. You're serious?" Gideon's face didn't shift. He pushed the paper across the table. "Tear it up now." Harlan gave a short laugh, trying to claw back ground. "Callahan, you know she's nothing but a saloon girl. You could buy 10 better in Kansas City for half that." The crash of another handful of coins cut him off. Gideon's great hand clenched on the table, his eyes burning cold. "I'm not bargaining. Tear the paper or I'll buy this whole saloon out from under you and put you in the street. The choice is yours." Sweat broke on Harlan's brow. He saw in Gideon's gaze not the drunken bluster of a patron, but the steady iron of a man who had weathered storms and didn't bluff. With a shaking hand, he drew a knife and slit the paper down the middle. Shreds fluttered to the floor. From the corner, Lenora pressed her hand to her mouth. Tears spilled. Not for the money, not even for the freedom from debt, but because for the first time in her life, someone had walked into the dark, faced down the world, and chosen her. Gideon gathered the torn scraps and tossed them into the fire, ink curled black, then vanished into ash. He turned, his voice like a verdict. "From this moment, you owe nothing." Her shoulders shook. Years she had endured alone, swallowing insults to keep breathing, learning silence as her only defense. Never once had anyone spoken for her. Never once had anyone dared strike off the chains. She wept into her hands. Gideon stepped close, laying his wide, weathered palm on her shoulder. The simple touch broke her last wall and sobs tore free. Outside the crowd pressed to the door, gossip already spilling into the street. The sight of silver coins, the hiss of burning paper. Soon every corner of town would carry the story. But inside that small room, only 2 people knew what it truly meant. One woman reclaimed from despair and one man choosing to give her freedom. At last, she lifted her face readied. "Why? Why would you do this?" He held her gaze, the firelight gleaming in his gray eyes. "Because since that night, you've been mine, and I won't let another man lay a hand on you." The words were plain, stripped of charm, and that was what undid her. She wept again, not for sweetness, but for the raw truth in them. Truth that left her no escape. Only the warmth of being claimed by something stronger than fear. Later, when they stepped out into the moonlit street, she walked at his side. His hand shielded her slight shoulder, his frame steady beside her. Dust still swirled, whispers still followed. But for the first time, Lenora felt she no longer walked alone. Dawn came gentle after the storm of the saloon. Gideon Callahan drove the wagon east, carrying Lenora away from Lonesome Hollow. The dirt road stretched endless, dust trailing behind, while ahead the prairie unfurled wide and green, washed clean by the night's rain. Lenora sat wrapped in her shawl, arms tight around herself. She had left behind the sour air of whiskey and smoke. Yet she could scarcely believe it was real, that she could leave, that no paper chain of debt still bound her. At the far rim of the horizon, Callahan Ranch rose into view. A stout wooden house stood firm against the open land. Thin smoke curling from its chimney. White fences ran long around pasture where horses grazed. Lenora's hand rose to her mouth. To her, it was more than a house. It was a dream she had never dared imagine might include her. Gideon helped her down from the wagon, his hand clasping hers, warm and sure. "This is where you'll begin again," he said quietly. Lenora could only nod, her eyes wet, not with despair this time, but with a fragile kind of hope. Inside, the scent of fresh timber and herbs greeted her. Gideon led her through a bright room where daylight poured through wide windows, then stopped before a door. He pushed it open. A tidy chamber lay within. A bed dressed in white linen, pillows straight, and a wardrobe left ajar. Inside hung new dresses, neatly folded, waiting. "This is your room," he told her, his deep voice even. Then, after a pause, his eyes softened. "But if you'd rather, you're welcome in mine. I won't press you. I only want you to know the door is open." Lenora froze. Her fingers trembled over the fabric in the wardrobe. Never in her life had anyone prepared clothing for her that wasn't meant for display before drunk men. Never had anyone laid fresh bedding only so she could sleep safe. She turned to him, the man who had torn her chains apart, now placing choice itself into her hands. Tears broke free, warm this time. Her first day at the ranch. Gideon made sure she did not feel adrift. He showed her the stables, the open pasture, the kitchen, every corner marked by his steady labor. That evening they sat together on the porch, and Gideon poured her a cup of hot tea. Lenora cupped it close, feeling warmth seep through her for the first time, not from cheap liquor, but from a kindness that asked nothing back. The days that followed taught her a new rhythm. She rose early, walking the fields beside Gideon, watching him saddle horses, mend fences, check the herd. Returning home, she set herself to small tasks, straightening her room, helping in the kitchen. Gideon never hindered her. Sometimes his hand brushed light across her back, and even that touch carried comfort enough to fill her chest. One afternoon, he came home with a bunch of wild purple flowers. He fumbled awkwardly, placing them in a clay vase on the table. Lenora's heart ached at the sight. She stepped close, whispering, "I never had a true home before." "Thank you." Gideon only clasped her hand, his grip steady, his gaze saying what words could not, that she was no longer alone. Night fell, and Lenora lay in her new bed beneath linen, smelling faint of hay. The prairie wind moved through the open window, carrying the chirp of crickets and the scent of open fields. She pulled the quilt over her shoulders, closed her eyes, and felt her heartbeat ease. For the first time in years, she slept without fear of fists on her door, without flinching at footsteps weaving drunk down the hall. And in her dream, she saw Gideon's gray eyes, warm as firelight, saw his hand extended, not to bind, but to lead her forward. That night, Lenora understood a home was not wood and stone alone. It was a place where a man poured himself into every wall, every blanket, every dress folded with care, so that she might finally know she was worthy of safety, of love, of choice. Word of Lenora Blake leaving the saloon with Gideon Callahan spread through Lonesome Hollow like fire over dry grass. The town had never lacked for gossip, and her name had long floated in whispers. Only now the whispers were louder, tinged with sneers and knowing looks. That girl, just a saloon piece. Callahan bought himself a plaything. A man like him choosing that kind of woman. He'll tire of her soon enough. Lenora heard it all, though no one said it to her face. Each time she went down to the market, eyes fixed on her own. Some smiled false, some shook their heads. The murmurs trailed her like ghosts, dragging her back toward the place she had fought to escape. In the first nights at the ranch, she sat by the window, staring out at the prairie, her heart heavy. She had a roof. She had sheltering arms. Yet the scorn outside felt like a fence of thorns pressing in. She wondered if she truly deserved it, if the town was right, if she was only a girl clever enough to find a wealthy shoulder to lean on. Gideon saw. He was not a man of many words, but his eyes followed each small movement of hers. One afternoon, when she sat silent by the well, he came and settled beside her. "Don't let the town's noise make you forget who you are," he said, voice low and rough, but steady. "I know the truth of you, and I'll stand by you, no matter what they say." The words wrapped around her like a cloak. She lifted her face, eyes wet. She didn't need to argue, didn't need to defend herself. One person believing was enough. Instead of hiding, she began to step out. She helped old Mrs. Carter with the crying children, brought soup to sick families, read aloud to the cowhands' kids by lantern light each evening. Small hands clung to hers. Innocent smiles made strangers look at her differently. Gradually, the town fell quiet. People saw Lenora kneeling by a bedside, wiping sweat from a fevered child. Saw her mending the coat of a ragged orphan. Saw her give away smiles that were no longer bought but freely offered. Gideon was always there, silent behind her, his figure like a wall of stone. When someone tried a cruel remark, the cool gray of his eyes silenced them. He never had to raise his voice. His presence alone closed mouths. One Sunday morning, as the little church bell rang at the center of town, Gideon led Lenora inside. Faces turned, curious, doubtful, but he kept her from trembling. In the middle aisle, he stopped, clasped her hand tight, and turned to the minister. "Father," his voice carried clear enough to drown every whisper. "I want to marry Lenora Blake before God, before everyone here." The air broke. Those who had whispered stood mute. Lenora froze, tears slipping down. Never had she dreamed of a day like this. A day a man would stand in the light and declare her his choice. The minister hesitated, then looked into Gideon's steady eyes and Lenora's tearful ones. He nodded. That very morning, a simple wedding took place. No grand gown, no feast, only neighbors who had come to watch. A clutch of wild flowers gathered quick, and prayers rising beneath the timber roof. Lenora trembled as Gideon slipped the ring onto her finger. A rough silver band glinting in the morning Sunday. From this day on, he said, you never stand alone again. She broke into sobs. Her face alight with joy. Not for the ring, not for the vows, but because at last every shadow, every whisper, every burden of debt had been pushed back. She was seen, chosen, loved completely. As the bell rang, Lenora laid her head on Gideon's shoulder. The prairie stretched wide outside, but for the first time, she knew she had found her place. A year had passed since the church bells tolled at their simple wedding, and Lonesome Hollow had not known such quiet change in living memory. Callahan Ranch, once a house standing silent against the wind, now rang with the laughter of a child. The steady beat of hooves across the pasture and the scent of fresh bread rising from the kitchen each morning. Lenora stepped out onto the porch with her baby boy pressed close to her chest, his small curls damp with sweat against her gown. He babbled nonsense sounds, then stretched a tiny hand toward the man working with the horses. Gideon turned, a fleeting smile cutting across the face long set by hardship. His gray eyes softened at the sight. He came forward, lifted the child from Lenora's arms, and set him carefully on the saddle, holding him steady. Sit tall, son, Gideon murmured, voice both stern and proud. The boy squealed with delight, clutching at the horse's mane, his eyes shining like they held the whole sky. Lenora watched, her chest swelling with something too deep for words. She remembered the nights she had cowered in a rented room, the stink of smoke, the sting of laughter meant to cut her down. It all seemed far away, almost unreal. Here in the arms of her husband and child, she had become someone new. That afternoon, as the sun spread gold across the fields, Lenora laid a cloth on the porch and sat with her son in her lap. She held a weathered book, its pages yellowed, and guided his finger across the letters. Ma. He stumbled through the sounds, then broke into a grin when he managed it. Lenora crushed him to her chest, tears sliding free. It was not a lesson in reading alone. It was proof that her story could be rewritten one page at a time with love. Across the yard, Gideon worked an old saddle with oil and cloth. He paused, watching wife and child, his scarred hands stilled for a breath. A faint smile touched his mouth. He had once thought his years would end in silence and solitude. But then a saloon dancer with fire in her eyes had stepped into his path and altered it forever. Spring carried the ranch into new life. The fences shone white against green. The cattle grew fed across the range and the stables rang with restless whinnies. Folks from town no longer came with narrowed eyes. They came with respect. They saw Lenora gathering eggs, tending chickens, bringing soup to neighbors struck by sickness. They saw her bend to wipe a fevered brow, patch a child's torn coat, give away unforced smiles. Gideon was ever near. His quiet figure a wall behind her. Whenever a stray whisper stirred, his gray gaze was enough to still tongues. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. One Sunday evening, as the horizon burned crimson, the family sat on the porch. Gideon held the boy on his lap while Lenora rested her head against his shoulder beneath a light shawl. They did not speak. They did not need to. The wind brought the scent of cut grass. The world seemed slowed and peace wrapped around them. Before the porch, Gideon had set a new wooden sign. The words cut deep red, love chosen, not forced, builds a home eternal. Lenora laid her hand against the carving, her heart tightening. She had lived a life bound by debts and commands. Her freedom measured in scraps. And now she stood beneath a roof not built from money or power, but from choice. The choice to stand side by side, to protect, to love. The baby spoke again. Mama. The sound clear and they both laughed through tears. Lenora pressed her forehead to Gideon's, her hand locked with his, warmth flowing steady into her soul. The prairie wind moved as it always had, carrying echoes of the past. But the ghosts were gone. What remained was a home, a man, a child, and a legacy. Love that healed. Love that endured. Love stronger than any whisper. And in the hush of twilight, their figures on the porch, man, woman, and child, stood as proof that sometimes the truest beauty lies only in this, to be chosen and to be loved to the end. When the story of Gideon and Lenora draws closed, one truth stands plain. Real love is not built on force or glitter, but on two souls choosing each other despite the past, despite the world's cruel tongue. From a dancer once dismissed to a wife and mother, Lenora had walked through fire to find her place. And Gideon, with his steady heart, showed that strength is not in possession, but in protection. At Callahan Ranch, where a sign bears the words, "Love chosen, not forced, builds a home eternal," that truth endures. It is more than the tale of two lives. It is a reminder that true love heals and leaves a legacy for those yet to come. And to you who have weathered your own storms, if this story left a spark of warmth within, share your thoughts below. Press like, subscribe, ring the bell, and walk with us into the next journey. Each nod, each word from you is a lamp we cherish in the fading.